The Bunjee Venture by Murtry, Chapter 10, Part 3. If you remember, they are in a very cold underground cavern and there is some horrible stinging jelly, like one massive jellyfish that joins together to form other jellyfishes, which seems to be chasing them. Okay. Andy felt his sister's grip tighten on his hand. She choked and she waved a hand at the wall. Andy, the jelly, it's everywhere. Immediately, a large section of the blubber slid down the wall, across the floor, past the base of a stalagmite and into the water. The rest of the jelly started making its revolting spluttering noise, much louder than before and faster, like a sort of excited chatter. That's it, thought Andy. The jelly actually sounds excited. Karen screamed, "It's in the water, it's coming for us!" Straight away, another large section moved off the wall and oozed into the water, and again the noise became louder. Andy clamped his hand over his sister's mouth. "Be quiet!" he hissed in her ear. She struggled against him, panic showing in her eyes. "Don't you see?" He tried to keep his voice as low as possible. "It only moves when one of us makes a sound. It must be attracted to noises." "But it's in the water, I can see it." She wrenched herself free and started swimming away from his against the current. He plunged after her and he grabbed her by the hair. Let me go, she screamed. Again, he clamped his hand hard over her mouth. Over on the far wall, another carpet of jelly slid towards the water. He looked frantically at the water around them, trying to see if he could see any difference in the texture, any sign that would tell him how close this see-through jelly was. It just looked like water. But the first piece of the revolting stuff might be pretty close now. Perhaps they were surrounded by it. Again, he whispered urgently into Karen's ear. "Please, Karen, you've got to stop making a noise. The more you panic, the worse it becomes. You must be quiet. It's our only chance." The urgency in his voice got through to her, and gradually she stopped struggling. He took his hand away from her mouth, and she nodded to him to show that she'd calmed down a little. Andy suddenly felt a ferocious jolting pain on the side of his neck. The jelly had reached them. He lunged to one side, biting back the cry of pain that sprang to his lips. "Listen, Karen," he said desperately. "Do exactly what I say. We're both going to make as much noise as we can. Then, when I shout now, duck down and swim underwater to the ledge with the stalagmites over there. Don't come up to the surface until you reach it, right?" She looked bewildered but nodded. Andy started to shout as loudly as he could, and she opened her mouth and screamed. Well, the walls of the cavern seemed to dissolve. Great masses of jelly suddenly came alive, and with incredible speed they slid down and across the floor and squelching and slurping into the water towards them. The children carried on screaming and shouting. Andy braced himself for the shock that would tell him that the jelly was almost upon them. It touched his ear, and he gasped at the horrible, terrible hot pain that suddenly filled his whole head. "Now!" he shrieked, and taking a deep breath, he ducked under the water. He could see quite clearly. The sunlight shafting through the holes in the roof overhead tinted the water a beautiful blue. Down below, he could see the jagged floor of the cavern, and he thought what a marvellous place it would be to swim if circumstances had been different. He glanced across at his sister, swimming alongside. Her face was screwed up, her cheeks were puffed out, and her long hair streamed behind her. They reached the wall, and he felt out with the flat of his hand. And he held out the flat of his hand at Karen as a signal to wait. She clung to the wall, a small stream of bubbles escaping from her lips. Andy reached up with his hand, his teeth clenched together in an anticipation of the pain, that would come if the jelly were directly above. It was clear. His hand broke the surface. There was no jelly. He tugged at Karen's arm and they both came up together, lungs bursting for air and trying desperately not to make any noise. Well, over in the centre of the lake, where they'd just been, the water boiled and erupted. They could see the jelly now. It reared angrily into the air out of the water in great gouts that spattered back to join the one heaving mass on the surface. The noise was terrific, but instead of being excited, it seemed to have an angry quality to it now. The two children eased themselves out of the water, keeping their eyes on the jelly. Suddenly, the spluttering noise died down, and so too did the carpet of floating blubber. It lay still and quiet on the surface, as though it was listening. It was listening and waiting. Andy pointed at one of the stalagmites. Climbing upwards, water dripped from his clothes with every movement, and it seemed to the children that the small drip droplets hit the floor with the noise of a tropical deluge. Still, it couldn't have been loud enough for the jelly to hear. There was no movement from the lake. The stalagmite had joined high in the air to a stalactite and formed a great pillar from the floor to the ceiling of the cave. About 2 feet from the top of this pillar, there was a hole, a beautiful hole that led out into the sunshine and their freedom. If only they could reach that hole and get away from this loathsome jelly. Standing beside the pillar was a smaller stalagmite. Andy motioned Karen towards it. He cupped his hands between his knees for her to use as a step stool. Sorry, I lost my place. Getting too excited here. And he pushed her upwards as high as he could. She grasped the wet point of the smaller stalagmite, found another foothold, and stretching out as far as she could, she leant against the pillar. From here, she could just reach the pointed end of a stalactite hanging down from the roof. She put her foot onto that, braced her back against the pillar, and started edging herself up in a kind of sitting position between the two. Andy started to follow her. By leaping up, he managed to get both hands around the top of the small stalagmite, then leant out to brace himself against the pillar. Just then, there was a loud snapping noise. That much from the top broke off, and Andy fell with a crash onto the rock below. His head cracked against the floor of the pillar, the foot of the pillar, and he let out a bellow of pain. Instantly, the lake became alive. He stared horrified as the water suddenly heaved up and the surface became like boiling porridge. The jelly suddenly appeared over the edge of the rocky shelf, transparent. Shapeless, blubbery hands swarmed across that flat surface, pulling the rest of the huge mass behind. The spluttering noise started up again. And up above, wedged between the stalactite and the pillar, Karen could contain herself no longer. "Come on," she screamed. "Move it, it'll get you." Well, the shout pulled him out of his trance. He picked up the broken end of the stalagmite, put it on the ground nearer to the pillar, and used it as a step. The jelly was right up onto him now. He looked down and saw it was now over his shoe. He stepped back onto the broken point and grabbed hold of the now flat top of the stalagmite. Let me show you. There they are. You can see the stalagmite joining the stalactite coming down that's made the pillar. And there he is. He's just stepped on a broken part. And can you see that at the top? That's where they've somehow got to get to. Goodness me. He's Andy's foot felt hot. He looked down in amazement at what was left of his shoe. The leather had burned away almost completely. A smouldering bit of black toe cap was all that remained. He kicked it off, his heart pounding. If the jelly could do that to a shoe, what would it do to a human body? He shuddered violently. It was too awful to think about. You wouldn't last a second. The jelly was creeping up the pillar now. It had changed its noise again and sounded excited. Andy put out his foot and placed it at the top of the stalactite, braced his back against the pillar and edged himself upwards as Karen had done. The stalactite looked terribly thin. Don't break, he prayed. Please don't break. He looked down. The base of the pillar was smothered in jelly, bubbling jelly, and it was now only about a yard, like a metre below him. He shuffled upwards as fast as he could. Nearly at the top now. Keep going, he muttered to himself. He felt sore all over. His neck, arm and hand had bad burns on them. He'd hurt his back and his head when he fell, and he was scraping his hands to ribbons on the rough surface of the pillar. Keep going, he said again. That's as far as we can go, Karen screamed at him. He looked up. She was wedged right up to the roof of the cavern. The hole was about 2 foot, 2 rulers away, along the roof of the cavern, to the side of them. So near they could feel the warm sun against their faces. Karen stretched out an arm and could just reach the underside lip of the hole. There's nothing to hold on to, she said. She was trembling and tears were welling up in her eyes. Feel again, Andy shouted from below. There's got to be something to grip onto. There isn't, came the reply. We'll fall if we try swinging out that distance. Andy looked down. The jelly was like 15 centimetres away, 6 inches below. The noise was dreadful now, the terrible excited spluttering like the chattering of old hags around a guillotine. He could feel the sweat trickling down the back of his neck. He looked up. Oh, Karen's gone! Karen, he shrieked. Karen, oh Karen! She must have fallen, he thought. He edged himself further up the pillar. The jelly bubbled and hissed inches below him. He put his hand out to the lip of the hole. Karen had been right. There was no handhole. He felt a sickening, burning pain on the back of his leg. He jerked upwards, away from it, the last 2 inches of available room, screwed his eyes up tight and waited for the end to be killed, burned alive by this jelly. Something hard and rough gripped his wrist like a vice and pulled him off the pillar. His stomach lurched as he swung into space, and then he was out through the hole and into the sunlight. He opened his eyes and stared at the brown face close to his, the big, soft eyes and the matted beard and hair. Hello, Daddy, he said. So that's a nice place to end chapter 10, and we can see now what happens next. Chapter 11 in the Bunjee. Keep listening. Bye for now.